Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who's made this visit possible. I really appreciate the hospitality, and it's really been wonderful to have a chance to be here. So I'm going to begin by talking about a particular person, I'll just begin. Sain Sab was a Gadi Nishin, the hereditary caretaker of a family shrine in a village about 2 hours north of Lahore in the Pakistani Punjab. And I met Sain Sab back in the 1980s. And I should mention that Sain means something like master or lord or religious mendicant, or more generally a respectable person, and is often used, especially in rural Punjab, for a kind of Sufi saint, in effect. And then Sahib is a term of respect, meaning something like sir in English. I had met his sister-in-law in Lahore during my research on living Sufi saints in the mid-1980s, because her son, Sain Sab's nephew, was a close friend of my research assistant, Anwar. Anwar described to me his own first meeting with Sain Sab. I have seen him. He doesn't look like a man. He wears gold earrings and pink clothes. When I went to this is Anwar talking. When I went to visit him and saw him from the back, I asked Tariq, his friend, if a guest had come, because I thought it was a woman. And Tariq said, "No, that's my Taya, my uncle or father's elder brother." I was embarrassed. So among Sufis in the Punjab and South Asia more generally, Sain Sab was far from unique in his gender ambiguity. Famous Sufi poets, such as the 18th century Bulleh Shah of Qasur and the 16th century poet Shah Hussain of Lahore, were known to have worn women's clothing on some occasions. And there are shrines such as that of Sheikh Musa in Ahmedabad, India, where followers today don women's clothes to celebrate his death anniversary at the shrine, as he had worn them in his lifetime. He'd called himself Sada Suhag, the Eternal Bride, which is also the name of the Sufi order that he established. In an era when the question of gender identity is often posed in terms of a self-interrogation to uncover one's real self as a woman or a man, irrespective of one's assigned gender at birth, it may be surprising to turn to Islam and Muslims, for whom women's and men's worlds are sharply demarcated, to help us think of gender differently. Islam and Muslims are often marked as other to the liberal subject of modern secular societies because of the stark divide between men's and women's worlds, perhaps most vividly marked by the seclusion or covering or headscarves of women. Yet there are aspects of Muslim practice and traditions that challenge straightforward assumptions about how this divide works and suggest an understanding of gender and its relationship to the body and the self that is very different from the understandings that underlie essentialized Euro-American assumptions and practices of gender. Judith Butler's important contribution to the disruption of essentialized gender categories drew on the transgender and the transvestite to help articulate her argument that gender is a kind of iterative performance, albeit not usually a consciously and voluntarily chosen one. In some circles of Northern academia today, for scholars writing against essentializations of LGBTQ identities, gender has even become a kind of play that disrupts middle-class normativity, respectability, and stability, though I might add often presented in deadly serious tones associated with social crisis. Judith or Jack Halberstam, for example, has articulated a queer temporality that moves away from a notion of body-centered identity to, quote, the potentiality of a life unscripted by the conventions of family inheritance and child rearing, while recognizing that not all gays and transgenders are interested in disrupting these middle-class scripts. And she does it in a very serious tone, I might add. For Halberstam, the transgender body thus seems to be functioning as an embodied signifier of social critique. And I'd like to take this interpretation of Halberstam a little bit further, and inspired by certain aspects of Sufi practice and thought, suggest that living gendered practices may serve as a form of embodied metaphor. Sainsab's living practice, I argue, is just such an embodied metaphor. And I aim to unpack its layers of meaning, sidestepping what to me is the much less interesting and essentializing question of whether he really experienced himself as a woman, since the very form of the question imposes a conceptual frame and vocabulary that has more to do with Euro-American notions of gender that are rooted in a very different history. And I might add, this is also a question that plagues much scholarship on what would seem like a very different discipline, that of Sufi poetry, especially when it comes to the use of a female voice by male Sufi poets. The idea of androgyny as metaphor has been discussed like scholars such as Tanvir Anjum in his work on the Sufi as the bride of God. But I would like to examine closely just what this means, what this idea of metaphor means, and how it works. Metaphorical embodiments and their significance can be traced historically through Sufi poetry, and the intricacies of the operation of such metaphors can be discerned with the help of Persian literary theory, with a nod towards the very different tradition of modern experimental psychology, as well as the more expectable tools of ethnographic and psychoanalytic inquiry. That sounds like a tall order, and this is just a beginning of attempting this examination. So, what is an embodied metaphor? When I thought of the term embodied metaphor to express what is happening with gender as it is inscribed on or in Sufi bodies, my first inclination was, of course, to Google Scholar it, since it just came to my mind. So I thought, well, I better see what else is out there. The only hits that seemed at first glance to be dismissible as irrelevant, since they came almost exclusively from the Journal of Experimental Psychology and were clearly, to my ear, jargony-sounding write-ups of tightly designed experimental procedures, with titles such as Embodied Metaphor and Abstract Problem Solving, Testing a Metaphoric Fit Hypothesis in the Health Domain, and Embodied Metaphor and the True Self, Priming Entity Expansion and Protection Influences, Intrinsic Self-Expressions in Self-Perceptions and Interpersonal Behavior. I don't expect you to get it unless you're an experimental psychologist. The work of these authors is based on an approach to metaphor that's actually a little closer to what I do, developed by linguist George Lakoff and philosopher Mark Johnson. Their book, Philosophy in the Flesh, insightfully argued that the most basic and seemingly abstract concepts studied by philosophy are deeply metaphorical in nature, and that philosophers take a small number of these metaphors as literal and then work out the consequences in meticulous detail. Building on this model of metaphorical cognition, experimental psychologists have used the term embodied metaphor to explore linguistic metaphors for the self that are based on bodily experience and help the subject reason about the world. Thus, the subject is often represented, for example, metaphorically, as a physical entity or a core-like essence, the inner self, which leads the subject to conceptualize a relationship as finding out who the other person is inside, so that the specific metaphor deployed shapes how people end up acting in specific situations. This recognition of the role of metaphor even in abstract reason is significant, but the specific form that metaphor takes in these examples is somewhat different from what I mean by embodied metaphor. I can begin to point to this difference through a description of how Persian metaphor works that can be found in an introduction to the Penguin edition of Conference of the Birds, an extended narrative poem by the 12th century Persian Sufi poet Fariduddin Attar. And to quote, "Persian metaphors are rarely the visual images that English readers expect to find in poetry. Instead, they juxtapose words which have potent associations in a way that deepens and widens the meaning implied by the passage. If the reader attempts to visualize the juxtaposition, the result is often ludicrous. Thus, when Attar compares the prophet's face to the moon in one line and the sun in the next, he does not want his readers to visualize the result. Rather, he expects them to combine the notion of beauty associated with the moon and the notion of solitary splendor associated with the sun." This is just a quick example, and there's a lot more that could be said. But if we understand the Sufi body as itself a metaphor and draw out the distinction that the authors introducing this volume have articulated, we could say that the Sufi's feminine clothing is not to be read as a visual image of an essential self as a woman, but rather that it evokes an array of what they called potent associations to various aspects of femininity that quickly point beyond femininity to other layers of meaning, moving across associations linked to the bride, to love, penetration by the lover, loss of self, surrender to God, an array of other affectively charged layers of significance that they emphasize cannot be captured by language. My use of embodied metaphor thus points not to sensory motor metaphors that pertain to bodily processes and orientations, as Lakoff and Johnston do, and what I would call more like metaphors based on embodiment, but to a use of the body itself as a signifier in a metaphorical relationship. In this case, the Sufi body dressed in women's clothes as metaphor points to the Sufi's love of God being represented as the relationship between bride and groom. It does not necessarily express an indexical link between the women's dress and the Sufi as essentially woman, whatever that might mean, although it doesn't repudiate that link. The Sufi body is then like a poem. As with Lakoff's philosopher, the body is being used to express a concept that cannot be easily articulated in language, a relationship with God and the experience of love itself, but the relationship of metaphor to embodiment is different. Along similar lines, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi has discussed the distinctive use of metaphor in the genre of Persian Sufi poetry called the Indian style, which was common in India but not limited to India. The chief achievement of the chief achievement of the Indian style poets was to treat metaphor as fact and to go on to create further metaphors from that fact. Each such metaphor in turn became a fact and was used to generate another metaphor. Metaphor thus became a phenomenon not merely of substitution, but of contiguity. Metaphor, in other words, became syntagmatic rather than pragmatic. And continuing the quote, "This is perhaps the single greatest innovation in the realm of metaphor in any poetics." And so this is something I'm just beginning to explore. So if you don't fully get it, I have to say I don't fully get it at this point either, and that's something I want to continue working on. Another approach, Talal Asad, is also concerned with the body and language, an anthropologist, so coming again from a very different tradition, and writes of the translation of a discursive tradition into bodily practices. His focus is on how the, quote, agent attempts to form appropriate feelings and thoughts in particular action. And he asks how the action can be seen as a moment in the formation of the self. So this is another relevant dimension because it points not to meanings, but to the way that what Sain Sahib actually does as a Sufi dressed in women's clothes is also an embodiment of Sufism as a discursive tradition, the behavioral customs and the sensibilities they teach and regulate in the process of disciplining the soul. He is disciplining himself to take a feminine stance in his approach to God and the world. So my goal is to map out the complex ways in which the Sufi body operates as a metaphor in a manner similar to a poem, tracing chains of association in the way a psychoanalyst interprets a dream. But in this case, I draw associations between a narrative of Sain Sahib's life and the realm of Sufi tales and poetry that animates Sain Sahib's world. So let me tell you a little bit more about Sain Sahib. My story of him is told not from his own narrative, but from the perspective of a family member, a woman who was his sister-in-law, a perspective that, needless to say, gives a particular slant on his life. And just to say something about women, Shahzad Bashir, in his book Sufi Bodies, depicts a medieval Persianate world in which Sufis built social networks and bonds of love without women. To quote, restricted from becoming objects of love, persons embodied as female remained marginal to the massive expansion of Persianate Sufi social networks during the 14th and 15th centuries. Masters and disciples, on the other hand, established love relationships that were unconstrained by the rules forbidding most contact between men and women. Bashir argues that women were thereby marginalized in these Sufi networks. The tradition is replete with stories in which male-female difference, quote, maps exactly to the interior-exterior dichotomy crucial to Sufi thought, enforcing the notion that women are tied to lower material forms while men have the capacity to delve into the highly valued interior of the heart, which can form a close link to God. The women, or especially wives, attached to Sufi masters are often negatively valued in stories about them, and murids, or followers, are sometimes depicted as competing with wives for the master's attention. Now I want to emphasize, I'm sort of talking about this angle on the issue of women and gender here. It's not the only story about women and gender that you'll hear down the road. Though the Sain Sahib I knew lived in 20th century Punjab, and I have to say I don't know if he's still alive or not, which is why I'm sort of locating him in the past. So though he lived in 20th century Punjab rather than the medieval Persianate world, his interpretive world was infused with the web of poetry and stories that positioned women outside the close bonds that characterized the relationships between Sufi masters and their disciples. Given that his life is an embodiment of the world-renouncing Sufi, a world in which women are a part of the world to be renounced, his sister-in-law's perspective gives us a lens rather different from the more usual perspective on such a life, that of the hagiography written by a disciple. So the first conversation that my research assistant Anwar and I had with Rabia, the sister-in-law, focused on her own son, who died young and had himself been known as a majzub, one who is attracted to God to the extent that he does not relate normally to the social world. He had had a special bond with Sain Sahib and might have become his successor if he had not died young. At the beginning of our second conversation with Rabia, several days later, Anwar asked her to tell us about Sain Sahib, who had been kind of a side figure in our first meeting. He said, Khalaji, which means aunt, tell us about your Jait, or elder brother-in-law, who is a pir, or a Sufi saint, basically. Tell us about the events that he foretold that came true, and his attitudes towards his family members. Rabia responded on a negative tone, with a negative tone, juxtaposing an ideology of sainthood with the tensions of family life. She said, "For him, all are equal, but in fact, he loves his followers more than his family." Anvar, "When you were married, you and your husband were cousins, and you already knew Sain Sab." Rabia said, "Yes, but I felt shame anyway. So Sain Sab told me to put on my dupatta, which is a thin shawl that you wear over your head, as a sign of modesty. It's a thin shawl that's worn by virtually all, or was worn by virtually all Pakistani women, either across the shoulders or on the head. And he had said to put it on my head in front of him." With this act of ordering Rabia to sort of cover herself in front of him, he asserted his male authority over her as the head of the family and imposed a kind of symbolic veil as well as as a real veil between them. Anvar asked, "Was he a sign from the beginning? He never got married?" And she said, "No, in the beginning he got married because he was the eldest. His mother cried because he wasn't willing to get married. And then he married his khala, his mother's sister's daughter. But he passed most of his time with his dada, his father's father, who was also a sign. For this reason, he didn't like marriage." This statement suggests that the close bond between sign and disciple is incompatible with forming a bond with one's wife. And we don't have to go into the causality that she's suggesting, that it was for that reason that he didn't get married. I'm not really addressing that here. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. In the Sufi tradition, there are many expressions of the relationship between the sheikh and the disciple being that of a lover and the beloved, and of competition between the disciple and the wife, as I've already mentioned. And if I had more time, I'd give some examples, but we don't need that right now. Anvar continued, "Did Sain Sab refuse to get married?" And Rabia said, "He neither refused nor accepted. He didn't return to the house for 12 years after his marriage. Instead, he sat in the village square outside. After 12 years, his aunt said, 'Divorce my daughter.' Sain Sab wanted his wife to become a Sain too, because, he said, what is there to take from this world? Our Sain Sab is a Langotia fakir, sorry, my pronunciation, fakir, which meant that he had made a vow of celibacy to never remove his loincloth or his lungi. When she was alone in the house, Sain Sab would come. So when she was alone and Sain Sab would come to the house, he would run if he saw that his mother wasn't there. So Sain Sab's, in this case, his sexuality is characterized by a piece of clothing, the lungi or the loincloth, and celibacy in the human realm is linked to his relationship to God. The bride saving herself for her union with God at death. Sain Sab's life embodies this world without women. In his sister-in-law's narrative, the wife is a temptation to be resisted. Sain Sab is bound up his sexuality and sworn to celibacy. The role of the mother is also significant in this narrative. Sain Sab went along with her wish that he marry, and he relied on his mother to protect him from his wife. Some stories in the Sufi tradition depict a transition of the murid, the follower, from a relationship of dependency on the mother to the master. Quite a bit of metaphorical imagery suggests the master's maternal function, so that we can even think almost psychodynamically of a transition from a close relationship with the mother to a close relationship with the master, the teacher, the sheikh. One hagiographer, for instance, describes how a sheikh he encountered while passing through a village encouraged him to stay with him. In other words, the sheikh said, "I want you to be my follower." The narrator of this narrative said, "I am a child of others. Even if you were to put your breast of training in my mouth, I would not grasp the nipple. Metaphors such as this suggest that there is no barrier for imagining oneself as a woman in these kinds of stories. But they and this reproduction of the mother-child relationship. But they also, of course, hint at the exclusion of women in these intimate bonds of love. Rabia went on to describe Sain Sab's divorce, which his wife's family had requested. After the divorce, she became blind and then died several years later. Rabia said, "He had no interest in the world. People say that she received a fakir's curse." And that's something else that it has links in the literature that I don't have time to go into. Rabia's story and Anvar's comments about Sain Sab's gender ambiguity, which he made as we were going through the comment I mentioned in the beginning, how he'd thought it was a woman, and he had made that comment to me as we were going through the tape of this part of the interview. And they point to the fact that Sain Sab's behavior lay so close to the edge of respectability that his presence stimulated anxiety and hostility. Rabia said, "The world is such that it does not give respect. On the contrary, he had to make a big sacrifice in order to gain respect. I fought with people, but once he asked me to sit down with him. He said, 'Rabia Bibi, tell these people what they want you to tell them. If they don't call me a bad person, then we will become proud. These people will, in this way, will wash away even my smallest sins.'" And then she continued, "Some beautiful fair-skinned women came to him one night, and they were wearing quite a bit of gold. Sain Sab told them to leave immediately. One person named Muhammad Din gave up all his worldly things and came to stay forever with Sain Sab because, he says, peace is available from Sain Sab. I have no need for land or home. Now he is, and this is all Rabia telling me the story still, now he has become very aged. First, Muhammad Din used to take charas, hashish, and bhang, a drink made with cannabis. But when he came to Sain Sab, he gave it all up. Muhammad Din, judging from this description, could be characterized as a malang, a religious mendicant who disregards the Sharia or Islamic law, something I've written about in an earlier article. Malangs are beyond the social pale, often associated with drug consumption, passing through the streets, dancing and playing drums, or living at shrines in groups. His presence, as well as visits from strange women, threw Sain Sab's respectability into question. His admonishment to Rabia was to adopt a strategy well known in the Sufi tradition, the malamati stance, drawing blame onto oneself as a way of removing self-conceit on the path to spiritual development. Sain Sab's identity as Sain gives him status and authority, but it also operates at the very edge of respectability and even challenges the foundations of everyday life, refusing the conventions of middle-class life, as we've already seen, and calling attention to the constructedness of social order by disrupting its ordering principles. But this is precisely the quality that makes sainthood so powerful. It forces people to confront the arbitrariness and limited nature of their everyday lives, thereby opening a window for the perception of something beyond. This is what Sain Sab himself told Rabia when she had felt her identity as a woman in a respectable family had been threatened. Yet women not need to be fully excluded from this saintly world. Sain Sab had hoped that his wife would also become Sain. It's significant that the Sufi biographer Fariduddin Attar listed the well-known 8th century Sufi Rabia of Basra among the men rather than among the women. He explained that this is not that it is not the outward form that counts, but the intention of the heart, and said, quote, "When a woman becomes a man in the path of God, she is a man, and one cannot anymore call her a woman." Similarly, the 15th century Persian Sufi poet Jami described Rabia as existing, quote, beyond the distinctions of biological gender, and wrote of another female ascetic, her heart rose high in spiritual flights, while into her ear profound mysteries penetrated. Don't call her a woman, for even one strand of her hair is still better than 100 men. Valerie Hoffman Ladd has pointed out that although this compliment paid to Rabia implies the degradation of the female sex as a whole, and suggests that true spirituality is normally found only among men, it also indicates that the sex of the body is not a barrier to the inspiration and grace of God. Furthermore, as some of these examples already suggest, gender is not tightly affixed to the body. And now I want to turn to a slightly different topic and think about the Sufi and the Hijra, which I will explain. According to Wikipedia, in South Asia, the death anniversary of a Sufi saint is called the Urs and is celebrated as a major festival at the saint's shrine. The Urs of Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti in Ajmer in India, and this is a quote from Wikipedia now, so high scholarly source. Okay, so the Urs attracts more than 400,000 devotees each year and is regarded as one of the most famous Urs festivals around the world. End quote. What the entry avoids mentioning is that in Urdu and in Arabic, and Persian also, Urs actually means a wedding or a marriage feast. In this context, at the shrine, it represents the union of the spirit of the deceased saint with God. The Sufi, the lover of God, becomes a bride at his death. Yet Pakistanis these days, including an anthropologist who has recently done research in Pakistan, have told me that many people don't even know that this is what Urs actually means, in contrast to my own memory that this was common knowledge back in the 1970s and 80s. And if anybody would like to contradict me on this, I'd love to hear it. But these were people who were visiting Colombia last week, actually. We had some discussion about this. So if it's true, I would suggest that there's perhaps been a collective forgetting that the annual festival is a wedding in a climate that is shaped by two discursive forces. One, anti-Sufi pressure by reformists to adhere strictly to the Sharia, defined in terms that often locate Sufism itself as un-Islamic, as some of you heard from me yesterday. And two, the emergence of the transgender as a legal category in a way that has changed public consciousness about a category of people, often called hijras, or more recently in Pakistani legal discourse, Khwaja Sara, who are visibly neither man nor woman, but something in between. The third gender is a gender identity and a legal category that was embraced and legalized in both India and Pakistan even before the legalization of the transgender in Europe and the US. It is particularly associated with the hijras, one of the terms commonly used to designate a tightly knit, marginalized community of people, mostly from lower castes, who are visibly neither man nor woman, but something in between. Okay. So this is actually somebody that was dancing at an Urs connected with Sain Saab's family shrine. So there's a connection with Sain Saab directly. Thanks. Though some hijras also undergo genital surgery, most do not seek to become real women, indistinguishable from those identified as female at birth. And there have been studies about these communities and what it means and some of the religious connections and that sort of thing. So the third gender, especially in this legal discourse, has become yet another identity category embraced by the logic of the LGBTQIA rubric, which appears to be infinitely expandable and actually expanded from the first time I mentioned it at the beginning of the paper, and capacious enough to encompass both the transgender and a third gender, rather than pointing to a process, any kind of process that might operate by an alternative logic. The hijra has become a rights-bearing, if marginalized and stigmatized, legal subject distinct from either man or woman. Within this discursive climate, gender is a serious matter to the extent that becoming transgender is now a legal matter rather than something to play with. This is in stark contrast to the idea of play that animates Sufi approaches to gender, and the metaphorical quality of the concept of third gender has been downplayed in favor of a signifier with a fixed meaning. In modern South Asia, the hijra and the Sufi are distinct identity categories, and in this current discursive climate, the Sufi and the hijra have virtually nothing in common. Though sociologist Amen Jafar, I guess you pronounce his name, who has been carrying out field work at Sufi shrines in Pakistan for years, was struck by the ease with which hijras and malangs, like Sain Sab's Muhammad Din, who I talked about earlier, who'd come to live permanently with him, he was struck by the ease with which these hijras and malangs intermingled at the shrine of Madholal Hussain in Lahore. Jafar suggested that a Sufi identity is to some extent a mask that makes the hijra identity more palatable for consumption, a kind of spiritualizing of a socially marginalized identity. And I'll quote from Jafar. The antinomianism associated with the fakir serves hijras well in presenting their own nonconformist gender presentation as a sacred act. Though he also argues that the hijras he encountered at the shrines do have a strong emotional commitment to Sufism that informed their identity as hijras. So he's kind of on the fence about whether there is any connection, and he's at least saying, isn't it funny that these two totally different kinds of beings interact so well at the shrines? Yeah. That suggests something about the way that gender is being constructed into these identity categories. The particular shrine where he observed this intermingling was that of Shah Hussain, a 16th century Punjabi Sufi poet who is known for his love for a Hindu boy, Madho, resulting in the shrine now being called a composite of their names, Madho Lal Hussain. And in one poem, Shah Hussain refers to his red tattered clothes as the dress of a bride, like the heroine here, who longs for her ideal bridegroom, Ranja. And I should mention that we saw Sain Sab actually wearing a red, maybe not tattered, but a red kurta, very similar to the kind of thing that he was probably talking about in this poem. And he said in a poem, "To hell with your white garb, better is the rag of the fakir. Only she is wedded who stands up to dance in his courtyard with an abandon." In yet another poem, the poet's identity with here is more explicit. "Crying for my beloved, I myself became Ranja. Maybe all the people call me Ranja and not here anymore. I have finally found the beloved I sought for so long. It was after meeting the sadhus," says Hussain, "that the uncertainty vanished." Note that word sadhu, which I'll come back to in a minute. And I also want to note, I don't know if you noticed in the picture of, I probably should have said a little more about the images I showed you of Sain Sab, that he was sitting in his red garb with these actually women behind him. And in one of the pictures, you can see the men facing him on the other side, and they're all wearing white garb. So the red and the white really contrasted in that image. Yeah. So you can see the men wearing the white facing him, and the women are somewhat more multicolored. And I don't know about that guy in the back wearing that weird plaid thing. And because I didn't know I was writing this when I took the picture, so I didn't select. As Scott Kugel explains, in this poetry we can hear Shah Hussein's words, but they emerge through the lips of a woman. In his poetry, he often spoke in the voice of a woman, specifically a young woman just reaching the age of betrothal. In this way, he not only breaks conventions about sexuality, but also transgresses the boundaries of gender roles. The gendered imagery intensifies as the female speaker calls her body a burning oven. This is a common metaphor for women's desire. Both Jaffer and Kugel stress that Shah Hussein's devotion to God involved forms of play in many forms, some of which violated the Sharia. Shah Hussein mentions the sadhus in the poem quoted above as a reminder that in the South Asian context, a similar sort of play with gender has been highly elaborated in the Hindu Bhakti devotional movement, in which male devotees assume a female devotional stance that they explicitly call play, taking on the position of the cowherding gopi, Radha, who, though married, surrenders herself to love with the flute-playing god Krishna. What this tradition points to explicitly is the importance of experiencing a female subjectivity to escape the limitations of the male subject position. So the use of the female voice is actually common also, not just in India, but in medieval Persian Sufi poetry, expressing the idea that gender itself is a limitation, a veil between the human and God. Even moving further from that perspective west to the Arab-speaking world, even the 12th to 13th century Arab Andalusian Sufi Ibn Arabi, one of the most well-known Sufi philosophers there is, expressed a similar idea in quite vivid terms, so that we can't just attribute this perspective to the Persians and the Indians. Quote, the disciple should not take up the company of women until he himself becomes a woman. If he becomes female and attaches to the lower world and sees how the higher world loves it, and sees himself in every spiritual condition and moment in perpetual sexual union as a female, in other words, assuming the receptive role in an unceasing act of coition, I don't know, sorry, and does not see himself in his spiritual insight as male first, but purely female, and he becomes pregnant from that marriage and gives birth, then, and only then, he may keep company with women and incline towards them, and love for them will not harm him. As for the Gnostics keeping company with women, permission to do so is absolute, because they see the absolute, holy, divine hand in their giving and taking. Everyone knows his own spiritual condition. So he's talking about a situation where, is it okay to go and hang out with women or get married and that kind of stuff, and setting the conditions for it. So now I want to turn for a moment to the gender of discourse. The late 11th century Sufi poet Ahmed al-Ghazali, who is brother of the famous theologian and jurist Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, manages to peel back yet another layer of meaning, another layer of the significance of gender. So I hope you're getting that what I'm doing here is unpeeling these different layers through these different contexts. Love was at the heart of his poetry. He was acutely aware of the inadequacy of language to express the experience of God, or even the love that leads one to God. Like other Sufis, he recognized a divide between the forms of words and their meanings. He speaks of the, quote, illusion of an outward expression, wherein a seemingly straightforward citation actually alludes to many layers of inner meaning. And I think we've been hearing about that. But he is also aware that the outward meaning of words may actually veil their inner meaning. And he says, "In the hearts of words lie the edges of a sword that cannot be seen except by inner sight. And the end of knowledge is the shore of love." Interestingly, this relationship between knowledge and love is gendered. As Joseph Lombard has interpreted Al-Ghazali, quote, "From this perspective, it is in the seclusion of a heart that has been emptied for God that spiritual realities are joined to the men of words or penetrated by the penis of discourse. The heart is beyond the realm of form, but is imagined as feminine. Quote, "Love cannot be expressed in words or contained in sentences, for the realities of love are like virgins, and the hands of grasping words cannot reach the skirts of their pudenda, or their genitals." While this expression of gender may seem quite far from Sain Saab's red shirt and jewelry, this understanding of language, love, and being is part of the discursive tradition that he embodied in his Sufi play. And I'll stop there.